So good evening, everybody. I'm using the mic because we are streaming so that our online students have the benefit of the discussion that we're going to have. So um, that being said, we're going to open up. Come on in. Um, we're going to open up with just a brief word of prayer. There is food in the back, so you all can grab stuff. There is a list on the table of what the sandwiches are because they're just by number. Um, but Dr. Ringer is going to open up with some remarks, and then when we go question and answer, we'll just pass the mic around. Do try to talk in the mic so that what's being recorded, folks out there can actually hear what it is that you are saying. Okay? God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for your blessings. We thank you, God, for the wisdom that is here in this room, in this building. And we thank you for Dr. Ringer and his willingness to share with us and to dialogue with us. We pray, God, that you would be with us, that you would guide our thoughts, that you would give us a roadmap of what it is we are to do and where we are to go from here, that you would bless our minds and calm our spirits, that you would bless this food, that all would be well with us. We thank you for these things. Amen.
Be with her and the realities of what's behind perhaps why she's even there. And so it was painful for me, very painful.
I'm not sure this mic is it working? Okay. Well, all of my emotions were overdrive yesterday because obviously for me, having been a practitioner for many years and seeing it over and over and over again, I just realized that so much of what was happening and the reiterations of slavery itself just compounded. And so I felt a real sense of syndrome from that slavery era. And I've been trying to justify in my mind why I missed some of the signs along the way. And at the same time, questioning, have I been lulled to sleep? But apart from that, my legal energy started to kick in when I saw the ways in which, Citizens United has worked against us, but for me, from a legal perspective, it works towards reparations when I see that corporations have actually been state actors, and state actors in a fashion in which they were deliberate in how to corral black bodies into a place of continuing that whole criminality along the 13th Amendment. So, it has inspired a great deal of angst about how, but certainly, my energies have been tapped into.
And the documentary yesterday was so terrifying to me. Although I've heard some story from my colleagues in the class, but the documentary yesterday was totally overwhelming to me. And I just looked it up on the internet. The African American population occupied 8.8% in the United States, and it's off my mind because maybe we are just suffering from the institutionalized discrimination and oppressions. Maybe it's time for us to stand up and the revolution now. Not only change was not enough now. We need to revolution now. Maybe this is my opportunity. So not only voting, and we also saw some news from FBI. They announced several news was not good to another candidate in the contest. I think there was a kind of institutionalized disadvantage to certain minorities issues in our contest. So it was not only change, maybe it's time for revolution now.
The documentary really reminded me of how fundamental reading actually is, because at first glance, you get very excited off of the 13th Amendment, of it being this quote-unquote freeing of black bodies from slavery. But then you forget about the clause that's within there, which says that if you are a quote-unquote criminal, then you're not free. And then you still get the concept of free labor that is provided by the quote-unquote criminals. And it also reminded me of how the image of a criminal is very crucial in terms of what image is painted as a criminal, what image is being projected as a criminal, so that way you can have this ideal in your head that this is a criminal and this is what a slave is, and it all connects back to one another. And it really, really reminds me of how fundamental reading is. When you think about the quote-unquote, and I use this word very loosely, creativity of white people during that time, when they decided, yeah, we're going to free the slaves, but here's how we're going to still be able to keep them within the same bondage and still be able to get the same works done out of them by instituting this clause. So it's very crucial that we read and that we recognize how fundamental reading is and reading everything, because that part is so easy to miss. It's very easy to miss. So I think that's what that reminded me of.
It was very disturbing to me, being the mother of a black son. And he's into sports and he's into, thinking about his peers. And when seeing that documentary yesterday, I immediately thought about his baseball team, because the statistics was 1 out of 17 white males will be in prison. And when he plays, most of the teams are white. But then it's 1 out of 3 black males. And that was so disturbing to me. It just really hit me in the face. I mean, you hear about it, but to see it was just really disturbing.
I don't want it again.
Well, there's an aspect of this society being built on plantocracy and slavocracy, and there's a deliberate shift towards even putting in place laws that continuously perpetuates that kind of setting. So after seeing this and watching it, what I thought was, what is it that the black community is doing in as far as lobbying for counter laws or for repealing of these laws? Is there any place where you can start off and you can lobby so that the laws at least are changed? Because what we saw was that there's a transformation from slavery to mass incarceration, and now even the jails outside of, what do they call it? When you have motion detectors and you're incarcerated but in homes. So it's mutating and it's changing. So the question is, what is being done?
I think the one thing that really strikes me about this is all of the footage and the audios of what the government had actually put in place. And I think as African Americans, a lot of times we knew that stuff was being done behind the scenes, but it was always seen as conspiracy theory. But actually seeing the memos, hearing the recordings was just, I'm like, I always thought this, but just hearing it was just gut-wrenching, that I knew this wasn't a conspiracy to start with, but the reality of it was still just difficult.
When you mentioned conspiracy, I think part of what is so disturbing about it, I remember when I was an undergrad, we would talk about conspiracy theories, but it would always be something like the Trilateral Commission, right? So it was always something like, 8 people in a room in another country, like plotting something, right? but we're talking about people in strategy rooms in major political parties. Right? We're talking about the everyday, ordinary political process in which these conversations about busing, states' rights, all of this kind of coded language. And so you're right, it's conspiratorial, but it's also very much hiding in plain sight. Right? It is a part of the everyday ordinariness of who America is. Right? And I think what struck me about the film was it had a way of imaging what we call the banality of evil. Right? It's normalcy. Right? How does it become so normal? How does it become so everyday? Right? How does it draw to it the legitimacy of all of our institutions? Right? And not only our institutions, but our own feelings, our own personal judgments. Right? One thing that 13th didn't shy away from, it did begin to open that door towards thinking about black legislators and black communities who were also calling for this legislation. Right? And one of the most difficult parts, I think, for those of us who care about these issues of social justice, it's hard to make these broad kind of social claims to people who are living through, right, certain kinds of violence. Right? So it's understandable that at a certain moment, there are people in African American communities that are calling on their legislators to do something. Right? So that the tension between what I call the kind of logic of mass incarceration as being overpunished and underprotected. That's kind of the logic of it, right? Being overpunished on the one hand, but underprotected, right? I think sometimes we forget that in the case of George Zimmerman, the protests were for the police to make an arrest, right? People were protesting for them to actually do their jobs, right? So it's a very precarious, I think and I thought about 13th, the relationship to also Dr. Joanne Terrell's sermon today regarding just the precarious nature of black life in America. Right? For a young teenager walking down the street and all of a sudden find himself at Rikers Island. Right? I mean, just the vulnerability, right, of certain populations in this country. Right? And to literally wind up in hell. And I use that language intentionally. From within the Christian tradition or the Christian imagination, if we say that hell is a use of time and space as instrument of punishment, right, then prisons by definition, without any hyperbole, is hell on earth. Right? It is a use of time and space to punish. Right? So I also want to share something with you. This comes from a book called Slaves of the State by Dennis Childs. And I think it's a good kind of, I just want to share kind of two historical reference points, and then again have a broader conversation. This comes from Slaves of the State. It says, Ed Rivers was arrested in Monroe County, Alabama in May 1910 and charged with petty larceny. He received a $15 fine, but additional fees amounted to $43.75. Unable to raise the $60 the court allowed him to become a part of the chain gang to recoup his manufactured debt to society, or he can be leased out to a private servant, retrieving the money through bond payment. Rivers decided to contract with a white man, J.A. Reynolds, to avoid the forms of death that might accompany him on a chain gang. Rivers escaped after 1 year to be rearrested, and other costs of $87 were added to his fine. Again, in order to avoid the chain gang, he signed with G.W. Broughton. In the opinion of the case, Justice Day argues that Rivers and Reynolds were effectively employer and worker. John W. Davis argued that the state has washed its hands of the whole transaction. So here we see fines, right, levied onto this person's case that they cannot afford. Right? They're already being arrested on laws specifically designed to target that community, and then you're faced with the option of the chain gang, right, or essentially become a slave. And between these two options, here's someone who says, well, this one is the lesser of the two evils, right? And then tries to escape, rearrested again, more fines, right? So there are these vestiges that are still with us, right? As it relates to, one, stigmatization, right? Laws specifically designed for particular populations, and just the political economy of it. Right? So this case went to the Supreme Court, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, this is part of his opinion. And part of what they were wrestling with was, their argument was that hiring himself out to an individual would be worse. Right? Of course, for those in the community, they said, no, the chain gang is worse. So again, the erasure of context. Right? So Wendell Holmes says this: there seems to be nothing in the 13th Amendment or the revised statutes that prevents a state from making breach of contract a crime and punishing it as such. But impulsive people with little intelligence or foresight may be expected to lay hold of anything that affords a relief from present pain, even though it will cause greater trouble by and by. So the court rationalizes this, right, based upon the inferiority, right, of black people. And this is an ongoing, perennial aspect of all these forms of legislation. Right? Not only the images of blacks and persons of color as criminal, but also some idea of inferiority, right, is always present. In addition to this, one thing that I think is relevant for the film and the argument that the film wants to make is that in 1890, we began to see prisons for the first time used to really argue about whether or not the Civil War was a good idea. Right? So the 1890 census comes out, and Khalil Gibran Muhammad lays this out beautifully in his book, The Condemnation of Blackness. And he says, now, without any reference to black codes, without any reference to context, we're simply looking at prison stats, and we're saying, okay, how are they doing now that they're no longer enslaved? Right? And so crime becomes an index for whether or not blacks should participate in democracy. Right? So when you think about kind of contemporary American culture, this is kind of the birth in which we discuss race through issues of crime. Right? So the O.J. Simpson trial, right? These kind of flashpoint moments. Right? So part of the logic of this is related to this issue of freedom, right? And who is deserving of it, right? And so crime is always about these larger issues. It's never about individual crimes. Right? Also wanted to mention too, so part of what the film does, I think, well in thinking about Birth of a Nation, the ongoing images of blacks as criminals. And I think I want to just also lift up that in addition to imaging blacks as criminals, this has a very practical application. It allows vast segments of American society to develop images about other places. Right? So when we talk about policing, when we talk about legislation that appropriates funds, we're talking about a large portion of American citizens who are okay with this. Why? Because they have imagined that the South Side is a certain kind of thing. Right? They've imagined this in their minds. So when you're watching Cops every single night, right, it's easy to assume that, yes, of course these areas should be policed more. Right? Of course you should have metal detectors in schools. Of course you should have all of these things. Right? This becomes kind of the naturalization of mass incarceration. Also, one thing I wanted to add to the film that I think was left out, The discussion on ALEC, I think, was brilliant. But there was something interesting in the film. They talked about private prisons. Right? Then they moved from private prisons to all of the different corporations that are involved in mass incarceration and how they profit. Right? What wasn't mentioned, and what I think got lost, is that these corporations, most of them, are contracting with the state. Right? Because only less than 10% of all of those who are incarcerated are in private prisons. Right, so private prisons receives a lot of our moral scorn, rightly so, but 90% of it is still, right, publicly financed. Right? So part of my own mantra is that I honestly believe that persons of color in general, black folks in particular, we should not be subsidizing our own death and oppression through our tax dollars. And that is a critical vehicle. So you mentioned legislation, right? I mean, we've got to really figure out ways to starve the system. Right? We've got to be vigilant in thinking about reforms, being critical about reforms that do not just add to, right, the prison industrial complex. Right? So I think we need to be critical when we think about criminal justice reform. If the reforms are adding more resources, right? As Angela Davis said in the film, historically, this doesn't lead to the kind of change that we're looking for. Right.
But even as there's some oddly bipartisan support for criminal justice reform and for changing the laws that, especially the drug laws that have so disproportionately imprisoned people of color and people in poor communities in the prison system, the vast majority of support is coming out of financial, they don't want, right? It'll save money if we don't arrest as many people and lock them up. And I fear that while one needs to make common cause and get the reform done no matter what, that not sufficient thought is being given at the policy levels to how to make sure that, since those are our partners in some of this work, that we're not just creating the new Jim Crow, right? And enabling yet another system that will continue to oppress black bodies in America. And I just don't think that's getting enough focus.
I think you're absolutely right. And the one real concern I have with the arguments that are purely economic is that there's nothing to say that if there's an economic turnaround, that we don't find ourselves back in, right? This doesn't come roaring back. And so the kind of economic only arguments really are really an issue because they lack that normative kind of force, right? They lack some kind of ethical bite, if you will. Also, too, and especially in the academy, we hear a lot of language about the carceral state, right? The only caution with that is that when you look at most state budgets, the language of the carceral state leads us to believe that criminal justice is the highest portion of most state budgets. And actually, it turns out that policing, law enforcement, the criminal justice system actually has a very durable way of surviving the booms and the busts, right? Because it is not the top budget item, right? And again, another example of going back to the policy question, in the 2008 downturn, when states and cities went to the federal government for help, a lot of what they were requesting was more money for prisons, more money for law enforcement. Right? So one of the, I think, things that we have to be vigilant about is there's a tendency to want to use prisons to fix economic problems and social problems. Right? So as those of you who were in the class this semester, the major difference between slavery and mass incarceration is that under slavery, the slave is the object of capital investment. Right? You purchase that slave. Right? In mass incarceration, the inmate is not the object of capital investment. Right? Most of them are not working. Right? Rather, it is the prison that is the object of capital investment. Right? So we are literally we are rendering entire communities surplus populations. Right? We are profiting off of their incapacitation and their incarceration, not necessarily their labor, as in slavery. Right? So I think that's a key distinction in thinking about how it is that the vestiges of slavery are still with us, but in ways that are very different, but also just as pernicious. Other thoughts? I want to respond to something you said about where were we, right? Because I think part of the challenge of this is I remember when a lot of the activism was around the war on drugs. But it was, I think, part of what we're looking at is, especially with Reaganism, a political economy that's overwhelmed with the institutions, especially within the black community. Right? So you had a lot of activism organizing directed towards the war on drugs, but then as it kept going, it then became about mass incarceration, right? It was literally overwhelming. Right? And I think also, too, I think I've shared this with the class this semester as well, my regret during the 90s was this kind of cultural ethos, which wasn't necessarily against protesting, but it saw issues of violence as an issue of lack of knowledge, right? That because we did not understand ourselves, that's why black people were killing one another, right? So an ideology that, hey, before it was the Ku Klux Klan, now we're doing it to ourselves. This is all mental slavery, right? We literally took this social problem and rendered it psychological, right? I mean, that was, I think, a real error, right? And I think, at least I know for myself, there was a time, especially under the guise of black nihilism, right? There was a time when I had thought, yeah, Cornel West is right. Black nihilism, this is all about meaninglessness. Now I think it's all wrong because I've evolved my own thinking about that. Right? But that would be, so when you ask kind of where were we, and I also think, at the time, a lot of this legislation was being passed in all kinds of sneaky ways, right? And it's just a matter of how do we develop kind of the networks to be vigilant about these issues.
I would hear you say that. However, I still have a pushback because I think as I look at the black church as this sort of continuing institution, that this place where our acceptability, our respectability is meted out. And then I hear messages like I heard today about being victims of bad religion. That there is still some need for us to examine whether there was a little syndrome from slavery or a little carryover, a little mind slavery in the Akbarian sense. But something has lingered. And that has to be examined too. Because if we don't examine that along with figuring out whether it's, jail is obsolete versus there can be a reform. If we don't figure that part out, we're going to find ourselves as a community still repeating some of our own ideological idiosyncrasies.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I think one area, there's a lot of discussion now about the politics of respectability. And I think that's a good example of when a particular tactic for a particular time becomes a kind of, especially within churches, becomes a kind of cultural norm, and we lose some of these larger kind of dynamics, right? We can't assume that everyone is churched. I remember growing up at Second Baptist, and I was a part of this evangelism team. And the person who was leading it said, all right, we're going to go out and we're going to knock on these doors. Now, we're not going to talk with anybody unless they're Christian. And it was like, right? Right? I mean, so the kinds of assumptions that we make about our communities, right? We cannot make these kinds of assumptions. But I think you're right. There has been a cultural break, right? And we cannot, and I think far too often, especially as it relates to young people, we want them to conform to us before we reach out to love them, right? And I think that's been happening for a long time, and I think it has exasperated a lot of these issues. So I think you're right. There's a lot to examine in terms of our stereotypes that we reproduce, right, within our communities, and especially within our churches. But also too the stigma within our churches. All of our churches are affected by this. Right? There are, but whether or not people can feel free enough to talk about it, I think that alone would be huge, right? If congregations really allow people to come forward and talk about the persons and their families that have been affected by the criminal justice system, right? That was a major kind of struggle in my own ministry, allowing people to be free to talk about that. I remember it wasn't until maybe about 3 years into my pastorate that I found out one of our members, her son was getting out of federal prison for 8 years, right? Never had a record, never been involved with law, lost his job. He wanted to keep up a certain lifestyle, right? He did it once, twice, got caught. They threw the book at him, 8 years. It's already present in our churches. The other issue, I think, too, that is very difficult is that not only are we disproportionately incarcerated by the system, we're also very much disproportionately employed by it, right? So one of the weird things that happened to me, I would go into Riverbend Prison or one of the local jails, and I would see people, hey, tell Reverend so-and-so I said hello. And they would be guards. There would be people working there. So it's not as if it's just us locked up, right? We're the prison guards, right? We're the staff. You go to the courthouse, right? We're there, right? So it's not just that we're on the inside in terms of the cell. We're part of the entire apparatus. Right? And how do we come to terms with what that means? It's difficult. And I think this is also partly related to historically the representation of African Americans within the public sector and how the public sector kind of morphed into this huge penal apparatus. Right? So it's had a huge impact. Huge impact. Other thoughts?
Well, I was thinking about your waking and staying woke, and grappling with the fact that that there's still so much we don't yet see. Right, every new article or whether it be the ways in which the bail system locks people of color and people who are poor up disproportionately, and that we need bail reform. Well, that was new after I already knew about, And then, what else don't I know yet that is part of the system, and the system can't be fixed until we know it, and we stay woke to it, and we change it. And so
Absolutely. There's always some new tentacle that's around the corner, right? And often it's very close to us. The bail system. As a matter of fact, there's a recent organization here in Chicago, the Chicago Community Bond Fund, which just recently started. It's doing some wonderful work around the bail issue.
Right, but then it gets more complicated because you have the people who are raising, the nonprofits who are raising money to pay bail so that people don't get locked up and lose their jobs and everything else that
Right.
falls after that. But you also have the bail system now starting to fund, because they don't actually want bail reform.
Right.
And they think if they can take the most egregious cases and pay for bail, that will prevent reform.
Right. Right. And there's also and I didn't realize this till, as you're saying, I heard it from people who have been incarcerated. There's an emerging market within the insurance industry that those who are returning citizens, that they are bonded, right? So their ability to get a job increases if they can say, hey, look, I'm insured. So all of your fears about me stealing something, all of your fears, I'm bonded, right? That's a growing industry. Right? So all these forms of investment, I really think that if you think about kind of the various movements of disinvestment throughout history, I think there needs to be a major kind of disinvestment movement that really does identify all of these tentacles.
So one of the pieces that I had wished had gotten a little more visibility in this film is, particularly with all of the kind of up to last week seemingly kind of footage and elements that were brought into it, is that over the last number of years there have been a number of remarkable coordinated efforts amongst prisoners to hunger strike and resist in the midst of those situations, particularly around dynamics of solitary confinement and some of the treatment that's happening there. So it feels to me like in terms of some of the gaining greater consciousness around the dynamics of the system and giving it the historical telling or retelling, perhaps, that would be necessary here. I also heard a number of stories in the film, the histories of resistance in these different moments, and it feels like in addition to bringing greater visibility to the impact of families that were a part of church fellowship with or other kind of communities of, part of the step here too is to not allow our mentality to be broken off here with this mythology around the criminal as other. That when we tell stories of this one who has been called criminal is my brother, is my cousin, is my child, and then also recognizing the creative and courageous forms of resistance that are taking place of these folks who seemingly everything has been taken away from them, and yet they are still finding ways to talk to each other even when they're all in solitary confinement, which is driving the system crazy because they have no idea how they're talking to each other, and yet they're actually communicating at a very high level with each other and doing things incredibly sophisticated behind those walls. So I think there's also a need to tell those stories and recognize that whatever organizing we're doing on the outside necessarily needs to be in relationship with the organizing that's happening on the inside as well.
So one of the other things that's of concern to me is the effects of this criminalization for those who do get out. And so the loss of rights and what we do about that, when we talk about legislation and those sort of things, that these millions of people who are in there and that when they do come out, what life is there for them, what the rights that are taken away from them because they have been in the system, and because many times because of, as you have spoken, for petty crimes, but their entire life is changed, and then their inability to make a decent life for themselves because, and when you mentioned the bonding, and we're now even making money off of their attempts to better themselves and to just make a living, to have a life after.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are so many barriers to those who are trying to put their life back together. And I think one of the things that I think part of this has to do with, here's where I think faith communities, religious communities can be really helpful in terms of building relationships, whether it's building relationships with employers, building relationships that allow people to have some kind of pathway. Sometimes it's even simple things. For example, sometimes those who are returning home, they're given, let's say, a sheet. Here are all the so-called felon-friendly employers, right? Oftentimes, half of them are not updated, right? The kind of frustration, right, that breeds. And then also, I think for community, providing persons with new communities, but also not saddling them with the burden of having to be the model, right? And how do you sensitize a congregation, for example, to say, look, we're with this person. Maybe they fall off the wagon. Maybe they get rearrested, but there's a commitment here, right? And we're going to walk with them. Right? I think also, too, for me, part of what I've learned also from listening to those who have been incarcerated, and again, this is part of the tragedy of it, is to hear from them what cannot be regained from having been incarcerated for a number of years, right? What has been lost in that time, right? That's difficult. That's a major. You can't assume work histories in the same way that we would. So there are a whole host of assumptions that have to be rethought when thinking about issues of reentry.
In other social locations, the prison system is called the correctional facility, where you go in and then when you come out, they sort of like correct you and change you and all that. Is there any hope of ever changing the system so that a person can have voting rights? Because from where I come from, even when you go back into the society, re-entry, you're allowed to vote.
Well, yes. It just takes a concerted movement and a lot of conversations, in order to make that happen. Some states have done it. I would love to see all states, I think the second you get out, you ought to have everything back. If you've done your time, right, you ought to be, all of those things should be reinstituted. But it takes a real concerted effort to make that happen, to make that policy change happen. And part of what you're dealing with too is even among those who are progressive, who have deep commitments to social justice, there are a wide range of feelings regarding how to address those who have been incarcerated. Right? So we can't assume that because there are people have commitments to social justice that they're all going to be on the same page. Right? It really requires a kind of deep cultural shift.
Earlier, you had said when you were pastoring how difficult it was to talk to your congregation. And it's so funny because just this weekend I was in a meeting and we were talking about, the people that are in our congregations, and most of our congregations are females, and then the men are in the churches. And my mind automatically went to where are all the men. But after seeing the movie, we know where all our men are. So how do we begin that conversation or resensitizing our community, our church communities, to begin to even talk about mass incarceration?
I think the best way is to begin with to begin with the persons in your congregation and building the kind of trust that will allow them to share information with you. And then thinking about how then you begin to kind of build community around that. I mean, it was easy for me to give the sermon about it, right? But when it came down to, so-and-so's son or their nephew, and when it became concrete, then it was a very different matter of would they be willing to share this, right? Would the congregation then embrace them, right? So it's, and then also too, I would say, finding individuals in your congregation that have a heart to do this. Right? Not all my deacons were, right? They're like, I mean, so, and what's interesting is that people who have been incarcerated, they will tell you who those persons are. I remember I was working with a brother named Dana, and I was trying to encourage him. I said, Dana, look, man, the whole congregation's behind you. He said, nah, Pastor, so-and-so's behind me. So he named 5 folks. They're in my corner. The rest of them, not in my corner. So I worked with them. Right, that was the ministry team, right? So it wasn't just kind of the deacons or this group. It was let them choose, right, who's in their corner, and those are kind of your go-to people when you're working with them. So I'm looking at Geraldine in the back there. And I'm surprised Geraldine hasn't mentioned the question of gender as it relates to 13.
Dr. Ringer knows this is near and dear to my heart, and people that know me probably do too. I'm just going to walk around because mostly everybody's back is to me, not that I have anything so important to say. This is not really a question, but just glad we could have the conversation. Dr. Ringer knows earlier this week in class, we looked at a scholar by the name of Beth Ritchie who was doing a lot of work regarding African American women. And when I was in the class on Monday, I told the class I was at about a 500. When I left out last night, I was probably over 1,000 in terms of emotionally, physically, mentally. Just, I can't even begin to put together what is happening. Because for this film, what I saw in 13th is just the historical and the continuation to today. That was almost too much, I think, for the majority of us to really contain in one sitting. It was so overwhelming that I just couldn't even do any work when I left last night. And so what's disturbing to me is not only that it continues, but when we get to 1 out of 3, and it's still growing. And now African American women are really faster growing, but people really don't know the statistics. And if it is just another form of slavery, and obviously it is, how do we stop this train that has really already run off the track, but it's still going? The interlocking ways that this process is so intermingled with law, with legislation, with corporations. I didn't know about ALEC, which was a big piece of the film, and all the participating companies, even though they did show several pulling out or pulling back. But I want to be on this side of how do we stop this, as opposed to working with reentry. Sure, I want to help those coming back, but where is the voice, and how does the African American, or how does the church, be it black, white, or something in between, come together in a way that is powerful enough? So yes, I'm disturbed, Dr. Ringer, for African American women, and for anyone who has not looked at Beth Ritchie's work, he can tell you more, but the way she looks at the compilation of the compiling of what puts African American women behind. It's not just one thing, but it's multiple intersectionality of various issues that put them there. And so we have to do something. And I don't even know what those answers. So again, I didn't have a question, or just thanks for engaging me, because I don't know where we go from here. How do we stop this? Slavery then, slavery now, economically then, economically now, maybe from different perspectives, but at the center is still black bodies, captured, confined. So how do we talk about this ideology of freedom? What freedom? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to add, I won't even venture a path, right? But I will just say this. I think part of our work is to connect or to highlight the relationship between mass incarceration and all the other spheres of society. Right? I'm convinced that we have to look at mass incarceration as not a problem, but a symptom. Right? It's a symptom of our larger social arrangements. Right? So if one is involved in education, working on that front, right? The school to prison pipeline, right? Thinking about school funding. A lot of persons who work with on the reentry side are now saying Medicaid expansion is the key. If your state is not signing up for Medicaid expansion, all the things these folks need will be covered under that, right? And that actually gives far more resources than the Second Chance Act. When the Second Chance Act went through, I believe it was, I want to say it was around $60 million. But you had 160,000 people who were coming out of prison, which means, again, that's about $100 per person. It's literally, right, nothing, right? But Medicaid expansion then would provide those resources, right? So I think whatever sphere we're in, there's a way to be working on this. Right?
Well, if there are no more questions, I know Dr. Ringer does have a 6 o'clock class, and it is 6. We want to thank him so much for his time and for sharing with us. I would invite you to get something to eat, to continue the discussion amongst yourselves. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you. And thank you for having me.